Good afternoon, Frank. I thought we should talk this week about the most newsworthy event of the last few days, which is that horrific shooting in Norway, which is particularly interesting as a landmark in the process of globalization, I think, because it happened in a country which is known for its mild manners and liberalness, and it was had nothing to do with Islam. It was a young man shooting mainly other young people, completely unexpected. And so some people may think it has nothing to do with globalization at all, because after all, on the surface it's purely local. It just has to do with Norway. But I would argue that it wouldn't have happened at all if globalization had not got to a certain point. And obviously the point that it's got to is the reaction of some parts of the population towards what's going on with immigration. And it's not the first time this sort of thing has happened in the countries of Western Europe, but it's a new type of reaction to it, and I think it's probably going to have new consequences. It's changing the whole debate about immigration.
I think if I take Breivik, that's the assassin's name, and if you take him at a point in time and look retrospectively, from what I take it, he was crying out against this multiculturalism and immigration policies that the Norwegian government embarked upon in the 1970s. And now Norway, of course, sits on top of a huge amount of money. All right, there's a tremendous amount of North Sea oil money there. It's probably the best remaining example of 100% cradle-to-grave coverage provided by a state. And you look at perhaps what he was lashing out against insofar as the contamination of the purity of the Western Europeans, whatever his rants were, and you take it up to the day of the event, we can certainly trace globalization effects leading to that. But then what I found even more interesting is post the event, this individual had a blog site that had a 1,500-page manifesto that encompassed all of his rantings and ravings. The second thing that struck me was that within 72 hours, 100,000 plus Norwegians gathered in Oslo, and the Prime Minister himself led a group of thousands of Norwegians to the primary main mosque in downtown Oslo in a show of solidarity, and entered the mosque and prayed in the mosque. So it's almost as if what's happening is the reverse of what Breivik, if that's his name, was hoping for, at least in these early days.
Well, it just shows that violence never seems to achieve the results that it's designed for. But I think that the actual consequences of the event will take some time to play out, and we don't yet know what the full story is going to be. But if we try to, it's very difficult to think about this sort of thing without being against it or worrying about or doing the sort of thing that the Prime Minister of Norway did, trying to temper the consequences. But I think it's indicative of the sorts of things that happen now that would never have happened before. And it's a sign of the volatility of what's going on under globalization. New sorts of things happen that would never have been predicted. And it takes some time for people to work out how to react to them.
You mean in this instance the new sorts of things that he reacted to were...
Well, what he did was a completely new sort of thing.
That in itself, yes.
And then we find out that, well, like other people who've committed terrorist acts from one side or the other, he has all sorts of intellectual pretensions, and he's not an underprivileged person by any means.
Right.
And then there's a spontaneous reaction in the society at large to do something to temper the consequences of the event, which is not what, certainly not what happened in this country, and is not what's happened in other Western European countries over the last few years.
Can you?
So the debate is in process, and it's difficult to predict how it's going to develop. But what it draws attention to is the tremendous amount of movement of people now that has been growing over the last generation, and has created colonies of non-local people in societies that have no experience of this sort of thing at all, and don't really know how to handle it. And this is indicative of a particular stage of the globalization process. A generation ago, it was just beginning to start, and I would argue that the most likely thing to happen in the future is that these communities will gradually cease to be enclosed and isolated among larger societies, and will be gradually move out into the larger society and become more homogeneous, and the whole quality of society will change. But we're going through a process, a phase in the process of globalization now, in which boundaries keep getting created, and as soon as you have boundaries, you have trouble. As soon as there are boundaries that people don't cross, don't communicate across, don't interact across, then people start hatching plots against the people on the other side of the boundary, and not accepting them as the same sort of people.
Well, and in this instance, unfortunately, Islam certainly seemed to be viewed by this individual as one of the boundaries.
Yes, and yet he's not attacking the Muslims, he's attacking his own people, who he accuses of sympathizing with the Muslims, and so encouraging a process which leads to the dissolution of everything that he finds valuable in Norwegian society.
Well, let me tease this out a little bit. When you mentioned earlier that the obvious solution, and one that you surmise could well happen, let's hope it does, is that these boundaries will begin to erode, and people will begin to move out of these self-contained units, which they've largely formed presumably for familiarity and protection, all of the cultural attributes that people possess similarly when they arrive in a new land, a new society, a new culture.
And these will begin to erode, and they'll be assimilated into the society. I mean, do you? I mean, let's look at some other examples. I mean, I've been familiar with the guest workers in Germany.
In Berlin, in particular, a very sizable population of Turkish workers who used to be huddled down by where the Berlin Wall was, in very undesirable real estate, which probably now is highly desirable. I'm sure they're long gone. But how have other Western European societies handled this? I mean, how has England handled this with their vast Pakistani and Indian population? Is this actually ever going to happen, do you think?
I think that we have basically the same situation in England, France, Germany, Sweden and Norway, and probably other countries that I haven't seen recently. In each case, immigration began soon after the Second World War. For a while, it was relatively small numbers of people who became absorbed into the local population, and then the numbers increased very fast in the 70s and 80s, and that was the stage at which so many of them sought shelter and protection among their people that they knew, and created colonies within cities, and in some cases some cities have become in the northern Midlands in England more maybe these people are the majority of the population in some cases, or in large areas at any rate, and it's Bangladeshis and Pakistan is probably more than any others, but also Indians and people from other parts of the earlier colonial territories. But this is also, I think, a stage of world history where people need a particular sort of identity, which is somewhat different from what people's needs were 100 years ago, or perhaps even 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to do with the numbers of people, because the world population is different and the densities of population in each of these countries is different now than it was 50 years ago. And then, of course, in 50 years from now, it's going to be different again. And I think so much of what we are used to in the quality of everyday life now is going to be different a generation from now. And then people won't form these huddled communities looking for protection. Mm-hmm. And the boundaries will start to break down. But obviously that's an optimistic view, and it would be easily, just as easy to construct an argument that led to a different sort of outcome.
But with the exception of, for example, the London bus bombers and tube bombers, who were born in Britain, who were seemingly from the outside fairly well integrated into British society or culture, or whatever. I mean, with the exception of obvious sore thumbs like that, isn't it something to be optimistic about, that successive waves of new young people being born to these enclave residents seemingly are either Norwegian or Swedes or British, and becoming much more so? Isn't the pace of this acceptance and the erosion of the enclave walls being hastened by the increased velocity in globalization?
Well, that's what one would hope, what one would hope, but it's difficult to predict what's going to happen economically. If we get an extended period now, especially because of what we fear may happen next week, of economic stagnation, then this sort of thing is going to get worse for a while. Mm-hmm. Probably simply because of the economic problems. Whereas if the economy were to take off again, and we have a continuous period of growth, and I'm not thinking entirely of economic growth, but economic growth is part of social growth, then I think there's more likely to be a social change in the direction of more homogenization of the society.
Do you think there's anybody betting on this now or playing this? I'm thinking in the hedge fund people. I mean, they're like the word du jour these days with the budget talks. I mean, are there investors or business interests or political interests or communication interests, such as Murdoch we discussed last time? Are there people who are exploiting these seams, that you think?
Well, there's so much experimentation in different ways to make money, and of course one never knows what's being tried out until somebody's successful at it, and then it gets into the news. Mm. But I don't think people think in financial terms, they think in technological terms, they don't think in social terms. And so most of what actually happens in terms of events like this that aren't just statistics on a financial chart or new products in the market, we don't become aware of it until after it's happened. Mm-hmm. So that we had no idea that 9/11 was going to happen. Even though we had all the data, or at least certain agencies had all the data that led up to it. Mm-hmm. In the same way, what happened in Norway, I don't think, well, it'd be interesting to find out later whether anybody had any sense that there were people like this who might be planning this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But essentially, socially, we're very naive. We don't follow social processes. We follow mechanical processes, and we follow financial processes, and we follow trade and general economic growth. But society is still in the way that Mrs. Thatcher told us in the 1980s. There's no such thing. It's just individual people.
Has that been the case from your view for a very long time throughout history, or is that just in the so-called modern era?
I think it's, well, social science didn't start until 150 years ago, basically, and so it's modern, but up until the middle of the last century, there was a tendency to think in social terms and look for the way society works. Mm-hmm. But the social sciences have not been the most popular sciences for the last 50 years, And particularly since neoliberalism came in, there's been a tendency to think in individual terms about everything rather than in social terms, and that makes it difficult for us to see these things when they're about to happen. And I think that that they're a symptom of the volatility, which is something we're going to have to live with as globalization progresses. So I think that's our time for today, and we'll see what happens next week.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time, Professor Spooner.